Hello, everyone, and welcome to TheraTalks. Today, I'm extremely honored to have Archana Jatkar with me. So, Archana is one of the leading voices, globally speaking, of the pharmaceutical industry. Archana is currently Associate Secretary General at the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance. Welcome, Archana.
Hello, Jose Luis, and thanks for inviting me to this interesting talk. And I'm really happy to speak to you on some of the pertinent, relevant global issues.
Thank you again. And yeah, so the idea today is to focus on an extremely important topic, which is the resiliency of the supply chain, which is obviously impacting access to medicines, globally speaking, and especially what we have learned after COVID and also the current geopolitical environment. So let me start by asking you about the lessons learned. And since you are extremely well positioned to have this global view, what we have learned about this discussion on the resiliency of supply chain after COVID and the geopolitical environment.
Yeah, thanks, Jose Luis. Very relevant question. And in the last few years, we've been reminded again and again that medicine supply chains are not just commercial networks, but they are about public health infrastructure. And the biggest lesson that we have learned is that, resilience cannot be built once the crisis begins. It has to be designed into the system well in advance. And over the last 5 years, we have seen one disruption after the another: the COVID-19 pandemic, the geopolitical tensions, the Red Sea, and now the Middle East shipping disruptions. And we've also seen increasing climate related events. Each of these have exposed vulnerabilities in global pharmaceutical supply chains. From the generic pharma industry perspective, resilience now rests on three pillars. One on diversified sourcing, the second on the end-to-end visibility, and the third one is how rapidly you respond, what kind of mechanisms have been put in system. So if we have to talk about the diversified sourcing, we've seen relying on a single supplier, one geography, or one shipping route is no longer sustainable. And we've seen during the recent Middle East Strait of Hormuz disruption, or whether it was Red Sea a few months back, shipping times have increased, freight costs have multifold increased in many cases, air freight rates rose to 2 to 3 fold. Companies with alternative suppliers and logistics route, they were able to maintain supplies much more effectively than those who have relied heavily on these one or two routes. And secondly, as I said, greater supply chain visibility is really critical in terms of how do we digitally track, can we forecast the demand in a better way, and what kind of close collaboration across manufacturers or distributors, regulators, or logistic providers. All of these allow companies to basically identify risk early on and respond before they experience shortages. So visibility therefore becomes as important as manufacturing capacity. And thirdly, the preparedness and faster response. Companies are now maintaining strategic inventories of critical, say, APIs and key starting materials. They're looking for qualifying alternate suppliers in advance, and developing contingency plans instead of reacting after disruption occurs. So there has been some learning there. If I have to speak to give you an example, from India, India's experience offers really an important example in terms, if you look at during the pandemic, India continued supplying medicines to more than 150 countries. And the manufacturers in India today account for about 20% of world generic medicines by volume and almost half of all the generic prescriptions dispensed, say, in United States. And this despite unprecedented global disruptions. This industry has worked very closely with the government, whether it is an Indian government or any exporting country government. Essential medicines have been flowing. Simultaneously, we are also strengthening the API security, expanding the domestic manufacturing, and diversifying the sourcing. So, if we have to talk, the broadened lesson is that resilience does not mean that every country is trying to become completely self-sufficient. That would neither be practical nor efficient. Instead, what I'm trying to say here is that the future lies in trusted diversification, multiple reliable sources of supply, geographically distributed manufacturing, and transparent supply chains, and a strong international regulatory cooperation. I think that is how we would be able to build the pharmaceutical supply chains that are both efficient in normal times and resilient during crisis. So the industry has moved from just-in-time thinking to a more balanced model of just-in-case preparedness.
So thank you very much, and extremely interesting what you have already mentioned. And I have to say, most of the points you made heavily rely on collaboration and cooperation of multiple stakeholders globally, governments, private sector, even NGOs, and so on. And in terms of the role the trade associations should play to foster more cooperation, more collaboration to achieve these extremely relevant goals. What do you see this role again should be, and in terms of the trade associations? What can be delivered to help this overall process?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. A very interesting question in terms, because when we talk about access to medicines, we're looking at shared global responsibility. No single country or regulator or a pharmaceutical company can ensure uninterrupted access on its own. And the supply chain for a single medicine, often spans across multiple geographies, whether from the raw materials and the APIs to manufacturing to packaging to what have you. That is why I think the international collaboration is extremely critical, more important than ever. And platforms like, say, I'm also a chair to the International Trade and IP Committee at International Generic and Biosimilar Medicines Association, which is a global generic and biosimilar industry association. I think, in short, it's called IGBA. So platforms such as IGBA or ICH or ICMRA, or the industry associations like IPA or other generic associations in various countries, they all provide a very valuable forum where regulators, industries, government, procurement agencies, and healthcare stakeholders, they can come together to solve common challenges. And we've seen that in COVID-19 pandemic, where not just in India, but across countries, all the stakeholders came together, collaborated, and came together to collaborate and solve the common challenges that the industry was facing. And I think therefore the real value of these platforms lie in creating trusted, evidence based dialogue that leads to practical solutions. And from the perspective of Indian generic industry, I see this collaboration becoming increasingly important. And I can give you, this importance, say, from three perspectives, and this might be true for most of the generic and biosimilar industries associations. The first that we see the importance of collaboration is in the regulatory alignment and reliance, where today manufacturers often generate similar data multiple times to satisfy different regulatory requirements across countries. So there is a greater reliance on inspections and scientific assessments, which is conducted by the regulatory authorities, and can significantly reduce duplication and shorter approval timelines and make medicines available to patients sooner without compromising on quality or safety. So, for generic medicines, I think where quality standards are globally established, regulatory convergence can have an immediate impact on the patient access. And if I can refer to you a wonderful paper by IGB on single global development, which talks about regulatory convergence. I think it's one of very important part why these platforms could be useful, and especially from the patient perspective. The second very important function that these platforms can provide, again, on strengthening the supply chain resilience. And we've seen that during disruptions in COVID-19 times, and more recently in the Middle East shipping crisis, which demonstrated, how interconnected pharmaceutical supply chains have become. And when one shipping route was disrupted, transit times increased by weeks, freight costs rose sharply, and close coordination between governments and regulators and industry actually helped prioritizing these essential medicines, by identifying logistic routes and minimizing the shortages. So those mechanisms, I think, should become a permanent feature of global collaboration rather than something which can be activated during the crisis. So again, these type of platforms do provide, facilitate this kind of strengthening of supply chain. And the third and most important, which point which I've been working for years, is on how the industry associations play an important role by bringing real world operational insights into policy discussions. And here, the associations or the global platforms, they can provide governments with um, timely information on supply constraints, on manufacturing capacity, on regulatory bottlenecks, or emerging shortages, which basically enables faster and more informed policy decisions. So I think there's a huge role these industry associations provide by giving practical ground level evidence to policy discussion. And therefore, I would say going forward, I believe that these international platforms should evolve as primarily as forums for discussion to becoming platforms for coordinated action, whether that's regulatory reliance or sharing supply chain intelligence or addressing drug shortages, or developing even common approaches to say emerging technologies. We see a lot of disruption by AIs these days, and these platforms basically provide that kind of a stronger collaboration that benefits everyone. And I mean, the more we align before a crisis, the better we can respond during a crisis. And I think that's the role I see for these platforms going forward.
Well, I couldn't agree more with your view, Archana. And yeah, absolutely. And now looking ahead, besides everything what you already mentioned, which is actually a lot, do you see other drivers that will impact the discussion about resiliency and then also, this diversification, collaboration? You mentioned also new technologies like AI and so on, but are there other drivers that you think will impact somehow this discussion, or are basically those that you already mentioned?
Um, in my opinion, the primary driver, and this I'm saying from a generics and biosimilar industry perspective, the primary driver will be the ability to combine affordability, quality, innovation, and resilience, because affordability without quality is not acceptable. Quality without affordability limits access. And both affordability and quality are at risk if supply chains are fragile. So the future model has to bring all these elements together. And from an Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance perspective, I think India has a very important role to play here. The Indian pharma industry has already demonstrated that it can deliver quality assured, affordable medicines at scale. This next phase is to move further up the value chain through, say, complex generics, biosimilars, specialty medicines, advanced manufacturing, and perhaps innovation-led partnerships. And for the next generation of healthcare leaders, uh, I would say my message would be very simple, that the healthcare or the pharma leadership is not only about markets, it's about responsibility. And we must invest in science, uphold quality, and build resilient systems, and keep the patient at the center of every decision. For decades, the generic industry has shown that it is possible to deliver quality assured medicines at affordable price. And if you look at uh, the generic medicines account for nearly 75 to 80% of medicines dispensed across geographies. In some countries, like in US, 90% of prescription drugs dispensed are generic medicines, and they only represent about 13% of total drug spending. That goes on to demonstrate the enormous value that generics create for healthcare systems, for the patients across countries. And I don't really need to say, but India has been central to that success story. And if you look at several statistics, you would realize that millions of patients around the world rely on the medicines manufactured in India every day. So that is both an achievement, but also a big responsibility.
Absolutely.
So the next chapter will look very different to my mind. It won't be enough to simply manufacture medicines at scale. The industry will need to produce more complex generics, biosimilars, or specialty medicines and innovative therapies. While at the same time, as I said, because of the technological advancement, I think you'll see more and more companies adopting advanced manufacturing technologies, digital quality systems, AI enabled manufacturing, and more sustainable practices in production. And as I mentioned earlier, also that equally important is building the resilient supply chain, and how do you create diversified but trusted supply networks. So I think those are very, very important aspects of what will happen. And for the next generation, I think of healthcare medicines, one simple thing that needs to be kept in mind is never lose the sight of the patient in every discussion, whether it is about international trade or regulation, pricing, innovation, or manufacturing. Ultimately, it comes down to one question: will this help patients receive safe, effective, and affordable medicines when they need them? And this is something which should be kept at the heart of all the discussions. And I think that's where the responsibility of the industry would lie going forward.
So thank you again, Archana, for your valuable insights and for your time.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and wishing you all the best for the future talks. Thank you.